And good evening. I'm Kathy Baughman McLeod, Director of the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council. I'm based in Washington, D.C. Welcome to a session on national resilience and national resilience strategies. I am very pleased to be here today with Dr. Angela Wilkinson, the CEO and Secretary General and first female of the World Energy Council, first CEO and Secretary General, and with Ekhosuehi Iyahen, the Secretary General of the Insurance Development Forum. We're going to spend about 15-20 minutes with you today talking about resilience. And resilience means many things to many people, and that's one of its greatest challenges. Also, how do you measure resilience? And how are these interconnected challenges and threats that we're facing today, how do we solve for those challenges? We can't do it one at a time. And so COVID-19 has shown us that if nothing else, the economic impacts of COVID-19 plus climate impacts, plus the biodiversity loss that we're seeing, plus inequities that we have fully seen in all of the harm and loss that it's causing, and so many more. And so when you think about defining what resilience is and how do you measure it for your organization, and for this session, even thinking about a national strategy, can resilience be contained within borders when the challenges that you face do not honor those borders? And what does that look like? And so from these organizations and perspectives, thinking about at several levels, the interconnected nature and also the systems that support and frame and challenge achieving resilience. And so when we think about at the Arsht Rock Center, we think about how do we prepare people to withstand and recover from these shocks and stresses. We've pledged to reach 1 billion people with resilient solutions, with evidence-based solutions, and we know we can't solve them one at a time. And we are in a hurry. And so let me turn quickly over to Dr. Angela Wilkinson. First question is, what have you learned at the World Energy Council from the energy sector in the face of COVID about resilience?
Hi, Kathy. Hi, Ekhosuehi. What we've learned is that we've tended to think about resilience in terms of critical infrastructures, the technology part of the system. And what we've learned from the COVID crisis is that the concept of resilience and energy has to extend to include people and communities and supply chains. And for me, resilience is about the health of connections, as you said, Kathy. And it's about the diversity of pathways that we're going to need to achieve sustainable energy. So we've learned that we've got to extend it to people and communities and to those supply chains if we're going to get those sustainable pathways.
Excellent, excellent. And Ekhosuehi, from the view of the Insurance Development Forum, what does resilience look like, and how do you define it? And then what have you learned from COVID-19 about resilience when you're looking at country-level strategies?
Well, great question, Kathy. For the insurance industry, risk is at the heart of what the industry does. And risk is related to resilience because it's about how do you understand your risks and how do you ensure that you can actually cope with those risks and bounce back from these shocks when they do occur. And I really appreciate the point that Angela made, which is that it's about lives and it's also about livelihoods, right? So how do we make sure that we reduce the loss of lives that we see as a result of these shocks, but also how do we ensure that people are in a position to actually thrive, to actually grow, to actually cope when these events occur. And so for the IDF, which is the Insurance Development Forum, resilience is actually at the center of what we do, because it's how can we extend the scale and the reach and the use of risk management capacities that exist within the insurance industry to support resilience. If it's at the household level, if it's within in terms of businesses or in terms of governments who are currently struggling to cope with the impacts of climate change and also COVID. So what lessons have we learned from COVID? I think that one of the primary lessons is that there's this dual focus that we need to have, but it's also about partnership. It's also about the recognition that the shocks that we are seeing are increasingly not things that the private sector address alone, or the public sector can address alone. So what are the kinds of new collaborative mechanisms and fora that we can establish to actually catalyze the kinds of solutions that are needed, or to scale up the kinds of innovations that we are seeing on the ground in many communities who are at the forefront of the impacts that we're seeing, if it's from climate change or even the COVID crisis?
Thank you very much. So over to you, Angela, for a minute to talk about the systems thinking. You know, it's challenging for humans to hold all of this, all these challenges at one time, and to think about the human nature, the systems, the infrastructure, and how to tackle it, and then do that together as a community. Could you talk about that from your perspective? You know, the role of systems.
Well, I think we should talk about communities, organizations, and systems. So we're the World Energy Community. We're a diverse group of energy experts in over 90 countries, over 3,000 different organizations. And that diversity is essential for resilience, because we have to engage with diversity and learn with and from each other, because there's no one size fits all solution pathway to sustainable energy, or to connecting energy and health and education, livelihoods and lifestyles and light bulbs. Energy is the ultimate connector. You've got to learn with diversity. So we're a community. We believe it takes a community, a whole and diverse community, to change an entire energy system. And we tend to think in very simple terms in energy. We tend to think electricity and use the word energy, but we have to think people need heat, they need power, they need storage, they need fuels. And so we need multiple different options. Organizations need to be resilient, right? So, you know, companies want to survive these shocks, governments want to survive these shocks, people and communities want to survive these shocks. And to be a resilient organization, you've got to engage diversity. You can't be one thing. You've got to be agile. You've also got to be adaptive and anticipate futures that might happen to you, whether you would want them to or not. So we have to avoid just thinking about how do we achieve our goals, and engage with futures that might be uncomfortable and unwelcome, but to make sure we prepare for them. And then systems are combinations of communities and organizations and people and technologies and emotions and facts. So when we're dealing with systems, we have to be less hubristic than we've ever been before. We have to recognize there is no overall view of a system. You have to work with the different perspectives and understand the system from within, not try and impose your understanding of the system from without. And you've got to engage that system, which is why we've got to work with people and communities and those impacted by transition in enabling the acceleration of this transition. We can't do it just through technology or through investment alone. We have to engage behaviours, and we have to engage the people who are impacted by the transition itself.
And so that brings to mind public-private partnerships and what role that they play. What you just described is complex and takes time. And I think for people in organizations and corporations all across the board thinking about how to do this, it's a new way of, to say stakeholder engagement is an understatement. This is a new way, an essential way to change the way we think and plan and spend, invest, and share information. Ekhosuehi, could you talk a little bit about, from the IDF perspective and your experience, public-private partnerships, and maybe an example of what it looks like, and maybe a project that you all are working on to show resilience?
Yes, certainly, Kathy. So I probably will use an example of, I'm from the Caribbean and also Nigeria, and a very real lived experience for me is the fact that in the Caribbean, when we would have hurricanes pass through, these events would cause significant damage. And we had a situation where governments would have real difficulty in terms of mobilizing resources to actually fund response to these events. Yes, eventually you could have some engagement with the development bank and mobilize, a year after the event, some access to some funding for redevelopment. But those governments were really challenged with an issue of budget liquidity immediately after the event, and how do they finance that? And so a critical question that we thought was, what is the opportunity to actually use insurance in that context to actually trigger resources early on to allow for earlier response? But that experience in itself actually showed us a tremendous vacuum that exists if we think about governments alone in terms of the strength of their risk functions, in terms of an understanding of the risks that they face. If we look at climate change and how are they proactively planning to address that issue, from an investment in risk reduction to investments in actual risk transfer mechanisms to address residual risk. So within the IDF, one of the things that we saw is that this was a gap that many governments face right across the world. And so we entered into a partnership with the United Nations Development Program, as well as the German government, to actually implement a technical assistance program where we could work hand in hand with 20 countries through to 2025 to support them on this journey. How can we help you to strengthen your understanding of the risks, but also what are the kinds of solutions that you need from a risk financing perspective? And out of that, each partner brought different strengths to the table. The United Nations Development Program is engaged in significant discussions with governments around their national development plans. How do those plans speak to risk, right? The German government brought funding to the table, and the insurance industry to risk analytics capabilities. And so what does that mean tangibly? We have a project in Peru where the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Finance, after the El Nino event in 2017, saw devastation to schools. And so their request to the IDF was, can we work with the insurance industry to put in place a coverage for 50,000 public schools? And part of which was to build a repository of what does that infrastructure actually look like, so that it's not only for insurance purposes, but it's just for fundamental basic risk understanding. But beyond that, also, how can we work with the industry to actually finance a program that could involve a proactive look at our procurement processes, so that when these events occur, we can get resources on board quickly to support earlier and much quicker reconstruction? And so for us, the challenge is not only looking at how the industry can contribute in terms of real practical tools, but fundamentally that issue of risk understanding and risk management. And I think that is really where you do need a multiplicity of views from different levels, people who are impacted, private sector, government, to really define sustainable solutions.
Fantastic. That's really clear. Really great example. Angela, in the chat before we were getting going, you pointed out something really interesting and a little, a bit of a cognitive dissonance for lots of planners and lots of leaders of organizations and companies and countries. And that is this constant drive for efficiency, this lean and mean idea of a company and organization, and then resilience, which is often in contrast to it. And it means we have to change our thinking about what resilience means. And does that mean, the just-in-time supply chain planning, or, we just have enough of whatever the raw material is, and even thinking about food security and stockpiling. And so could you talk about that for a minute? I think that's a really interesting and important point, because we're going to need to do some shifting and some refreezing, as they say, in change management. You have to unfreeze and then you have to refreeze. We're going to have to refreeze on some things. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think the challenge is that neither life or history runs in a straight line, and we're not sprinting to the future. It's more like we're running a pentathlon, and we've got to have different capabilities and attributes to be able to adapt to what happens. And for that, you've got to have different muscles, and you've got to think of those different types of muscles. And you've got to carry a little bit of body fat. You've got to have a little bit of a buffer if you really want to be resilient. So, the way markets work is they tend to work in terms of capital market efficiency. What's the cheapest way of doing something? But the cheapest might not be the most resilient way of doing something. So we end up with a little bit of a tension there. But I think just in energy terms, I have this big thing around humanizing energy, the people side of things. If we really want to be resilient in energy terms, we've got to think who is resilient to what, not just think of resilience as a general thing. So if we want to come out of this crisis as a more resilient energy system, let's just take one tiny little example of Ethiopia with 18,000 health clinics that have got no energy supply whatsoever. And we don't just need to supply those health clinics with the energy to cool vaccines. We also need to give the community the jobs, we need to give them the capabilities, we need to give them the industries so that they can continue to grow. And this is the big challenge, I think, in energy resilience terms, is we've spent 100 years thinking about energy from the supply side, and now we're going to have to think about it from the user side. And we're going to have to think about customer-centric energy systems and what resilience means to that. And that's turning the whole system frame round on its head. So what do uses and users of energy need to be resilient? And then what does that mean for the supply that we provide to them?
Fantastic. That is where, with just a minute and a half left, we're just giving the this community a taste of resilience. And this is, it's a journey, not a destination. I think, Ekhosuehi, from your view, in just a minute or so, what does the next year look like for resilience through the eyes of your organization?
From my perspective, for us, it's a focus on those 20 countries where there is an interest in actually engaging with the IDF. And I keep harping on this point, but what are the risks that you face, right? We have to get specific with our questions, right? And also really engaging these communities, engaging the governments to understand what is it that they face, what is it that they're challenged with, and what are the appropriate solutions. So again, it's not a cookie cutter approach to this, but really trying to match what the needs are on the ground. And that is also where you will get innovation that could actually be quite instructive in terms of what the future of resilience could look like. So I'm really quite excited by that program that we have within the IDF over the coming year.
Fantastic. Well, our time is up. I want to say thank you very much to Dr. Angela Wilkinson and to Ekhosuehi Iyahen. Thank you, ladies, for a stimulating conversation and just a taste. I hope that the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week invites us back next year to talk more fully about resilience, and we've got quite a year ahead. So again, thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us, the community here. And we look forward to next conversation on resilience and deeply understanding and turning everything on its head. Thank you so much.
Thank you.